Hello everyone. So welcome to a hands video for the first time in a while. I always find these really weird. Look at my hands, la la la. Okay, basically today I'm sort of dealing with the aftermath of having conquered one of my biggest, maybe longest standing fears earlier this week. So I'm feeling super awkward and super stimmy and sort of really shy, and just sort of investing in a lot of like pretty things, self-care, visual stimulation, all of that kind of thing to kind of get myself through the very natural, organic aftermath process of that. So, you know, just the whole like keeping myself company and being gentle while I realize that I actually did the thing. Who knew something positive could feel so intimidating? Anyway, so, well, positive, bittersweet, I don't know, stuff. So here is a video that I'm going to try and make sort of off the cuff about a particular sort of deck phenomenon or deck usage phenomenon that I've seen over the years in various iterations, and that is the idea of a dedicated deck to a deity, a spiritual entity, some kind of usually disembodied intelligence, sort of guidance figure, anything of that sort. So whether it's more of a devotional and deity, hard polytheist perspective, or whether it's a bit more cosmic than that, or rather, you know, pantheist or whatever than that, or nebulous. This idea that there's a particular deck dedicated to the purpose of receiving messages and or just channeling that kind of way of being, I think is fairly prevalent, although obviously not required. What's always fascinated me about it is not that I've ever felt that it's been required of me in any way, or that I've felt pressure to partake in this particular way of using decks. But actually just that I've felt curious over time in a way that I have realized I've never really been able to settle with an answer on. And I want to kind of explore that in this video. I did ask about this actually over on Instagram, just sort of really informally as sort of part of a post. Just saying, like, do you use one deck, more than one deck? Like, how do people seem to come to that arrangement? And I got a few, so far anyway, as of the time of filming, I've had a couple of answers that are really interesting. Some stressing that actually they find Oracle appeals to them more for this sort of thing, that it was a much more sort of straightforward, oh, why don't I use Oracle for that? And then are actually considering adding tarot. Thea over at Garden Goddess Tarot very kindly answered that she sort of organically came to the use of, I believe it was the alchemical tarot, for her connection with Hermes. And I do believe she's mentioned that over on her channel before, which I think is super cool. I love hearing her talk about that sort of thing. It's just fascinating. So, you know, we have these different ways in which people use them in the first place, obviously also varying with things like belief system, whether or not you have a pantheon, how you conceive of things like deity or guiding spirits or whatever it is for you personally. But then we also have this idea of, you know, did you come to it organically? Did you sort of, because another thing I've often heard people talk about is, I want to purchase a deck for the purpose of communing, for example, with deity, right? People make that executive decision ahead of time and then either intentionally go and find a deck that works for that, or are just sort of continually on the lookout, you know, just keeping their eye out for that sort of thing. All of which is super interesting, obviously valid, or I would hope obviously valid, but really interesting to me. Now, what were the issues that I was having with that? I'm going to pick this up so you guys have something to look at, but also so that I can think. Some of the issues that I was experiencing with that is that I definitely feel drawn to the notion of using a specific deck with my particular deity. And I'll get to describing that a little bit in a minute. But the issue is that the notion of one deck doesn't quite seem to make sense for me. And even one tarot and one oracle doesn't totally seem to make sense for me. So The deity that I engage with, as I think anyone who has watched my channel will pick up on, is loosely speaking the Morrigan. That is the most common name by which she is identified, both in the, I suppose you could say, in the medieval literature, but also just generally in terms of like modern popular neo-paganism and so on. I want to state, as I always do on this channel, that especially as an expat living in Ireland, I do not have the ability to speak to the Irish experience here. And although I am very keenly aware of some of the differences between the ways I might talk about or approach this topic versus people here, and I have taken pains to immerse myself properly and sort of know where I'm at and why the differences matter. I also don't want to come across as talking over Irish voices on this particular topic. So I always want to sort of place that caveat that all of what I'm about to say, regardless of whether or not I have done any research or whether any of it is corroborated in any kind of primary or secondary literature, is still at all times going to be based on personal associations, personal gnosis, personal experiences, favorite topics, and so on, all according to the way my brain works in the world and according to, necessarily according to my own experiences and preferences. So the point being, take what I say with a grain of salt. If you are curious, go find Irish creators, find people who have all sorts of lived experiences within this tradition, double check your resources, and just keep an open mind and be really curious, and don't take what I say as any kind of quote-unquote gospel truth. Okay? Awesome. Disclaimer out of the way. The Morrigan. The first issue that I come across is that she has like a bajillion names. And depending on whether or not you take a slightly more archetypal approach, I am rather hard polytheist in nature. However, I include under this umbrella not only any such figure like the Morrigan associated with Ulster. I include aspects of similar figures such as Maeve from Connacht. I also include archaeologically discovered names from Munster, and so on and so forth. Additionally, within the stories, there's a lot of references to bird-headed women in similar roles, to different sort of classes of being that bear the name Morrigna or Baiva. I include certain appearances of the name Cailleach, or the word or title or type of person called Cailleach, excuse me. And furthermore, there's, obviously lots of different ways in which you can understand her persona to be named. The Morrigan, potentially also being An Morrigna, which is the plural. You have Anand as a possible name for the Morrigan. At times, it depends. You have names like Baiv. You have names like Macha, and the various iterations of her, whether they are euhemerized or not. And you also have names like Nevon, and even sort of more tangential names, Thea, Eru, all these sorts of different sort of nebulous figures that sometimes may be co-identified and sometimes not. Some of them shape-shifting into animal form and sometimes not. And when we get into things like animal forms, there are many, many different animal formats that she kind of will take on, depending on who you say she is and when. Crow, cow, wolf, eel, being some of the most obvious examples that come to mind. And then we have also the ecological component. The more obvious being bodies of water such as rivers, mountains, especially mountains being associated with the breasts of the goddess. A much more sort of cosmogenical approach there, although at least from my perspective, the Morrigan is definitely not a creator deity. There's also relational aspects around who the Morrigan talks to, who she interacts with, either in the form of other loosely speaking deities, because again, Ireland doesn't totally have a pantheon in the way we often use that word. But then there's also human figures or semi-divine figures and so on. So it gets very, very complex very quickly, which is part of what I enjoy about it. All of this is the sort of thing that I work with work with. I don't know how people feel about that term, but it's usable, so it's convenient for use, so I'll use it. Anyway, to the decks. So I recently realized, I guess you could say organically, except that I think at least 2 of these decks were purchased with this possibility well in mind, knowing that this was a likelihood. I have decided, at least for the time being, I've been in and out of using multiple decks for this sort of thing in the past, and it's never really stuck because it did always feel a bit too synthetic. This feels like it's come up a little bit more organically, so I have decided for the time being on 5 decks. 3 tarot decks and 2 oracle decks. And I'm not going to be holding myself to using only these decks for the purpose of communing with the Morrigan, because again, it's a bit too, my brain is a bit too nebulous to expect myself to hold to that. But I will say that, for example, this deck, which is the first tarot deck that I will show for this purpose, anyone who's been on my channel before will recognize this bag that I made, but this is the Hush Tarot. By the way, I actually want to mention, look at my tarot cloth. Isn't it pretty? It was actually given to me by a subscriber. Thank you. I don't know if you want me to mention your name, but I'm so excited about it. It's so pretty. Look at the colors. Look at that. Oh, beautiful. And it stays put perfectly, which I was struggling with before, so thank you. Okay. So this is the Hush Tarot. And again, this was purchased not necessarily to commune with the Morrigan. This was purchased because I actually, as far as I remember, was looking for something that would sort of do the whole Arthur Rackham thing for me in my practice without actually being the Arthur Rackham deck itself. And if you're interested in how I make sense out of that, I have an entire video dedicated to analyzing the art and art historical references in this deck, including things like movement composition, color theory, ink composition, drawing technique, and so on and so forth, historical references. So I'll link that in the description box if you are interested. But this deck, for multiple reasons, really tends to get use when I'm thinking about certain themes within the larger sort of topical umbrella that I associate with the Morrigan or other such characters. One of those things being death and death positivity. As anyone who's been on this channel for a while knows, I'm extremely death positive. I'm really interested in a lot of very macabre things, and I'm particularly interested in the way in which incorporating aspects of shadow in that regard not only benefit us on the personal level, but on the societal level in terms of access to things like resources within different types of communities, marginalized peoples, cultural practices, and also just a slightly more organic understanding of how death works in order to support life, and not necessarily only in a binary sense. So that's a huge part of how I end up actually engaging with the Morrigan a lot of the time. There's definitely an established idea in certain literature that, or at least a theory, that you could say that, you know, one way in which we are sort of guided into the afterlife is through the consumption of our bodies by the goddess in the form of a crow. And I find all of that sort of thing, plus the sort of differing sizes of the humanoid figures in this deck compared to the animals around them, also plays nicely on this notion of the other world and the sort of wonky aspects of the she, the people of the she, and sort of folkloric components of that ongoing. So again, you have this sort of world in which it's not really ever clear what size you are, whether you are alive or dead, what's to be trusted, what's not to be trusted. You'll see there is a very common sort of mask motif going on here, which anyone who's seen my last video will know is a pretty big deal to me. So point being, lots of personal associations going on here, but this is the deck that I should perhaps say historically throughout my practice has already acquired a very strong association with the Morrigan, if not an outright sort of dedicated usage, a very sort of mystical Gnostic perspective on that as well. And yeah, based off of almost like more visual ideas and sort of modern ecological narratives and things like that. And yeah, so this deck definitely immediately sort of sprung to mind because it kind of already fulfills that function, including notions around like chaos versus order and sort of nature that things like destruction play in our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. Blah, 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 lots of philosophical ideas. The Hush Tarot. Okay. Next, tarot deck. And I don't think this will come as a surprise to anyone, except insofar as, to me, I wasn't expecting such a direct association, except that I kind of had. So it will be the Pagan Otherworlds Tarot by Uusi. You would think, like, well, obviously, Otherworlds, pagan, Celtic symbolism, loosely speaking, mysticism, all of the stuff that I've talked about in all of the videos I've made about this deck. But really, it wasn't necessarily immediately apparent to me until some of the recent research / work / question asking I did of this deck. And until I kind of had resolved the issue I raised in an earlier video around the idea of otherworlds and the unreliable narrator. That plus the sort of vast open expanse of this deck has a very Tir na Nog kind of quality to it. And the element of this deck that could be termed less personal or impersonal or less egoic, but also very highly symbolic, really strikes me as what I tend to associate with the Morrigan as a more sort of impersonal, you don't get to ask me very direct questions kind of approach. For a bit of context, a lot of my understanding of at least my relationship with deity is that I don't often, if I make direct prayer or if I ask direct questions, or if I try to establish in any way extremely direct, imaginative, personal gnosis contact with the deity, with the Morrigan, I don't feel that she is beholden to answer me or even acknowledge my existence. As I kind of stated before, I feel much more that I just sort of exist under the auspice of her wing, and that it is my job to sort of see the world as she lays it before me, all of the options in front of me, and make sovereign decisions based on the presentation of that information to me. So this deck feels a lot like, this deck looks to me like a lot of medieval Irish poetry sounds. A lot of the sort of ecological, very distinct atmospheric manner in which feelings and experiences and words are written on the page, are narrated, are alliterated, and so on. And again, it brings with it that much more, you are out in the world, in this case the other world, and it is up to you to be paying attention, to ask the questions, to approach things with an open mind, to look around you, and to make decisions about who and what you are to rely on. There is a presence here that is very, very sacred, but it's not going to spoon feed you the answers. There's a bit of work involved. It's not unpleasant. It's not necessarily cold, although I suppose you could see it that way. For me, it's just much more a little like, you know, that sort of push in the direction of knowing that I have the autonomy, the wisdom, the personal authority, and the sovereignty to make my own decisions, to assess the world on my own terms, and get creative about that. And this deck is a very, very direct visual representation of that because it makes space for me in the world that it presents. And there is obviously now, at least for me, that really, really intense association with a lot of sort of Gnostic experience of an inner sort of astral landscape, loosely speaking within an Irish or Celtic kind of set of associations. So hopefully that makes sense. I feel like that was incredibly garbled, and I'm not even doing the thing that people do where I'm supposed to be like showing you all the cards in like a really nice, diligent way. So I will try to do that going forward in this video. Cards. Neurodivergent person trying really hard to remember what I'm supposed to be doing with my hands while looking at a camera and talking and not getting distracted and not going off topic because I get fixated on what I'm saying, you know, all that jazz. Oh, actually, last thing I'll say about this deck too is that for me specifically, since a lot of the material, textual material we have on the Morrigan and so on is from the Middle Ages, I approach everything from the sort of, instead of calling it myth all of the time, I have a tendency to call it medieval literature. And I appreciate that this deck just brings with a little bit of a tip of the hat to sort of historical deck systems. That just makes my little nerd brain happy. And I felt that was lacking actually in my understanding of which decks I might associate with dedicated work before. So now I feel like I've answered that, at least to my current satisfaction. The last tarot deck, therefore, hold on, let me take a sip of my tea. Witch's Brew. The last tarot deck is my most recent acquisition. It arrived just the other day, and this is one that as soon as I saw it, I was like, where have you been all my life? I need to buy you for this particular purpose. And it is the Murder of Crows Tarot. And once again, thank you to Thea over at Garden Goddess Tarot, because she featured it in one of her Insta stories, and it was one of the very rare moments where I saw the deck on her table or on anyone's table and said, oh my fucking God, tell me what deck that is. Why do I not know what deck that is? And she actually said, I'm really surprised you've never heard about this deck. You are going to love it. And she is not wrong. I'm obsessed. Murder of Crows Tarot. I didn't want the edition that had like all of the extra red on the card images because my eyes can only handle so much. And I liked the severity of this. I also like the notion that like everything becomes a silhouette, just like crows are against a bright, cloudy Irish sky. Bright and cloudy, you say? Yes, yes, for sure. I love these backs. Look at that. You could just go in there and get lost. Okay, so let's do that slightly more diligent deck thing. Is this gonna work? I'm a bit nervous. I'm a lefty too, so I don't know what to do with this. Anyway, so in this case, I liked that there is a very sort of gothic, scary, haunting quality here. And honestly, quite a lot of these images really make me think directly of specific stories within the medieval Irish literature. This one, for example, also there are folk narratives around the stuff that this reminds me of, but we definitely have at least one Irish mythological story within the Ulster cycle, as well as folk narratives where a figure is made to carry basically a ghost, is often kind of how it's referred to, that is half of a body on their back, either for long distances to be deposited within a church that has space, so folklorically, you know, a churchyard that actually has a free grave, or in the case of myth, we have a story of Cuchulainn coming across a half-headed phantom in the field, and while searching for Conchobar, to place him on his back and carry him out of the field. And that story also does involve a mention of the Morrigan, or I can't remember if it's the Morrigan specifically that's named, or if it's by off the top of my head. But point being, I saw this and I thought of several different stories, either within the myth, loosely speaking, or more specifically within folkloric folk narratives and fairy stories. And I just love the creep factor here. Also, look at all the brambles. Brambles. I'm obsessed. Okay. I also do like that we have here a lot of loosely speaking, medieval clothing, medieval inspired clothing, perhaps. I like that not all of the characters, or almost none of the characters, are giving you, you know, the hugsy, feelsies vibe. I'm not a very huggy, feely person myself, so I don't respond negatively to the lack of that. I love that the horses in this deck are also often masked and or not totally clear if they're really horses or not. So basically, you know, the idea for me here is that there are, although you could do anything you wanted with this deck in terms of personal associations, I do get the impression that this deck is often used by those who work with the Morrigan, regardless of their sort of pedantic approach, as you might say for me, or whatever other approach they take, whether it's a little bit more soft polytheist or a little bit more eclectic or whatever else it is, there does seem to be a commonality with this deck that takes place. And I think that's really interesting. I always find that sort of thing like, wow, how interesting where people overlap with their personal experience with the deity and where they don't. So yeah, I do also like that this deck involves a bit more of that sort of like harsh understanding of royalty. Look, 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 it's like the Sacred Bull. It's just so cool. This death card is the coolest thing I've ever seen. Like, oh my goodness. Can I just go there? I just want to be there. Not to celebrate suffering necessarily. I just want to go there and like wonder at the emotional experience that is like physically embodied in this card. Like this for me would be a path working card. Also, I'm terrified of cows. This would be a really interesting way to like get over my fear of cows. By the way, you guys, when cows attack you, they are organized. Like they have full on like ways of communicating. I have been herded by cows as part of 2 groups of people, but that's another story for another time. I don't even want to go there. Morrigan on the mast. Dark one, are you restless? Do you guess they gather to certain slaughter? Oh my goodness. Anyway, I need to stop, but you get the idea. This deck, for sure, slots in straight away, brings in a little bit more of that overt royalty and sort of mythic narrative maybe, element to it. So we have royalty, macabre nature, narrative, mythic narrative, whereas the others, with the pagan otherworlds tarot, we have a little bit more of a otherworld setting and sort of disembodied voice and more general presence, emphasis on personal authority, if, you know, obviously all of them have that. And then with the Hush Tarot, we have a lot more of that, are we an otherworld being or not? A lot of shape-shifting being the primary narrative of that, as well as sort of visionary, mythic, Gnostic thinking. So then remaining 2 decks are 2 Oracle decks, because I did feel like that was missing, and I also have Oracle decks that like were screaming to be included. So the first Oracle deck is perhaps not a surprise. The Urban Crow Oracle. So first things first, I really must disclaim that I am not a huge fan of the guidebook for this deck, and I also don't have the expansion pack. I love the art, but I've had a finicky relationship with MJ Cullinane's work just in terms of my personal response to it. No discredit intended or a criticism of her as an artist or her work. I would just more generally identify myself as not being part of the target audience, if that makes sense, just in terms of how my taste tends to work out towards her decks. But again, discussion for another time. Urban Crow Oracle, I feel, is quite successful in terms of the actual images on the cards, and certainly the color scheme of this deck is proper chef's kiss. I don't care that Oracle cards sometimes don't have reversible backs. I really don't care generally about that issue. But like, look at these. Oh, I could just stare at that for ages. I edged the edges. I edged the cards. I did an edge job on this with a, what was it? Black Copic marker. So here we have, the way in which this actually relates to communing with the Morrigan is that I don't believe I've mentioned on this channel before, but I do practice a little bit, or not a little bit, basically anytime I'm outside, I practice ornithomancy, which is using bird flight, numbers of birds, and so on to kind of also divine in the way that we might with tarot. What I find is really interesting and useful about this deck is it does really, I live in an urban environment. I live, as I've mentioned before, near Cork City. And I find that this deck, to me, basically just looks like Cork. Look, it's Sorsha soaring. Teehee. So yeah, I live in an urban environment, but like in an Irish sense, which means, at least for Cork anyway, beautiful, quirky, really like small and manageable, but like not without resources and artistic experience and so on, but also slightly dilapidated and definitely very damp. So I just, and covered in crows, so many crows. So there's rooks absolutely everywhere. Everybody who has an even slightly less used chimney pot has jackdaws in their chimney pots. And in the city center, if you want to find, if you're not rural, where they also tend to be, in the city center, if you want to find hooded crows, just go to the River Lee. I've seen like literally hundreds of them all in one place on the River Lee near the university. It's just beautiful, beautiful, beautiful. So this basically to me looks like my day-to-day experience on some level or other, you know, sort of coastal river town kind of scenario. And I know that she's also worked in various narrative elements in this deck to that are included in books like Gifts of the Crow. So, you know, the art is well thought through, and it does reflect a good amount of my own personal experience. Just always observing the crows around and above me, swirling around me here in my lived experience. So for me, this deck is has a direct correlation to what it feels like to engage with the crow aspect of the overall goddess in a modern lived urban environment. It bridges that gap so beautifully, and it's just wonderful to have a deck that reflects that, that does that, and does it so well, so well. So yeah, you know, in terms of making the divine real and part of your every single day mundane life, not that I use this deck every day, but you know, the idea being that that's what this deck is for me, it just made it a shoe-in for inclusion in this sort of loosely speaking dedicated deck category. Okay, last deck is, as I said, another Oracle deck. This is another me-made bag. And this one is the Green Wheel Oracle. Again, this is one of those decks that it's by far one of my favorite decks. It's one of my most personally sacred decks. Look at the brambles on the back. Oh, could you just die? I mean, it's just beauty personified in a deck. Danielle Barlow, you know what you're doing. Anyway, so this deck is already one of my most sacred tools, to the point where I occasionally get quite precious about it, although I don't hold myself to that. And when I feel called to use it more frequently, I'll use it like to death. And when I don't pressure myself about it, which is generally my policy about all my decks. Another reason I keep my deck collection on the smaller side, because I don't like to worry about my frequency if I tend to lapse in my attention span and so on. So part of the reason I wanted to include this deck in this category specifically is not only because it has a very sort of modern neo-pagan mixed with an acknowledgement of history, or, you know, sort of a historical vibe, or a more traditional approach, folk approach, but also because it brings color, like really intense, beautiful color, into the proceedings. You'll have noticed that with all the other decks, obviously except for the one that's literally monochromatic, I went for a much more sort of muted color scheme. And one of the reasons that I have a little bit of an issue with that overall is because Irish myth specifically is garishly colorful. The medieval literature is garishly colorful. It's to the point where if you actually like try to picture or say do a drawing of some of the stories, you're gonna like, just everything will clash. Literally, it's as flashy as it can possibly be, with all of the sort of cheese ball energy included. And not only does that obviously make sense in terms of like the mythic structure, but it also makes sense just from a historical medieval aesthetic. Again, sticking within the loosely speaking interpretation that this is medieval literature. And I wanted that reflected, that sort of lived, colorful, vibrant experience reflected in at least one of the decks. But another reason that this deck is included is because, again, it takes on that ecological approach, as did in some ways the Urban Crow Oracle, and it takes, for the most part, humanoid figures out of it. Every time I look at this, I either think of the Beatrix Potter 1990s animated version of The Tale of Pigling Bland, and I can literally hear the music playing as I'm saying that in my head, or I think of The Tale of Maktaho's Pig. Either one. Cosmic pigness happening here. Boar. Anyway, where was I? The sort of non-human nature of this deck. I really wanted to make sure that I was addressing the sort of other than human, slightly more animist perspective to be found in a relationship, at least for me, with the entity that is the Morrigan. It's not just that she is to be respected in human form, it is that you never know what shape she will take on, because that is what she is capable of, from my imagined personal astral perspective. And I don't feel that that is limited only to the animal forms that she takes within the stories, like on the actual pages explicitly. Although obviously there's a special connection for those. I also think that this helps me take away some of the perhaps excessive emphasis on corvids, crows, ravens, magpies, all of that sort of thing. Obviously they get emphasis within loosely speaking Irish or Celtic or Morrigan followers overall, and also indeed a lot of just witchy folks or pagan folks and so on. For reasons, you know, they're fascinating creatures all on their own, but I personally find that sometimes I can fixate to the detriment of my awareness of everything else around me, and I don't like doing that. I like to be as observant as possible. So yeah, like here obviously we have one of the more humanoid figures, except that it does this within a sort of a more cosmic understanding, a representation of the points on the wheel of the year, the sort of fire festivals and so on. And I do really, really enjoy and appreciate that. So, yeah, there's also an element of this deck of like keeping time and acknowledging where you're at folklorically within the wheel of the year, if we're going to use that sort of modern synthetic term. So I really like that as well. So yeah, just to kind of recap, just to kind of recap, while I'm flipping through the rest of this deck, we have 3 tarot decks. One which deals much more overtly with things like death positivity, sacred decay, shape-shifting, and a notion of a relation around shifting of size and significance and your place in the sort of cosmological arrangement of the world. That's embodied in the Hush Tarot. We have a deck that explores a much more sort of historical aesthetic, an ecological aesthetic, a Gnostic or mystical perception potentially of the entirety of the other world, as well as the sort of cosmic, in my case, people of the she sort of characters that you might encounter in such places. Along with a much more sort of just disembodied present or presence aspect of how I perceive the divine. So the notion that as you wander about, the guidance is there. It's just not necessarily an overt voice in the way that you might expect from other sort of ways of thinking about that. So that's the Pagan Otherworlds Tarot. You have the Murder of Crows Tarot, which for me speaks a lot more directly to actual, explicit, discrete mythological stories, to a much more sort of royalty aspect contained within the notion of sovereignty and sovereign myths and sovereign stories. A lot more appearances on a mythical level of things like horses, and in the case of the death card, a bull. Also bringing into the picture the notions of different types of vocal sound, and also the use of fear and terror, if we're talking about Baiv and or Nevon, and also especially when they appear together. The sort of whole demons of the air, creatures of the glen, howling component of a lot of the stories. and indeed of Celtic warfare generally. So that's, you know, that and a few other things is covered by the Murder of Crows tarot. And then we have the Urban Crow Oracle, which for me is a much more sort of bringing my practice into the sort of environment in which I live, and doing away with the insistence that they need to be some kind of polarized, mutually exclusive set of worlds or imagined experiences, bringing it all into the present, and certainly very much connecting with the sort of Corvid aspect of the entire thing, which is the most immediately accessible symbolic animal around me, but then also learning to respect animals within urban environments as well. So again, taking it away from just being an egoic pursuit, researching about Corvid life and so on, and taking myself out of the proceedings in that regard, in terms of like who's at the center of the world kind of perspective. And then last but not least, this deck, the Green Wheel Oracle, bringing in color, bringing in more folk practice, an awareness of my place on the planet, my place in time, with its emphasis on the moon phases, rather the moons of the year, and the fire festivals and so on. And also bringing in a lot more of that animist perspective, a lot less figural representation, and again, reiterating that sort of ecological perspective as well. So, oh yay, ending on the fox card. Look at me. I'm obsessed with foxes. Anyone who would who knows me and comes to my apartment, literally the number, like the amount of fox art as well as fox throw pillows and things in this apartment is kind of absurd, rivaled only by the amount of bird corvid related imagery. Yep. Okay, so yeah, there you have it. Again, like to answer sort of my question for myself, this has been a mixed way of coming about this. Some of this has emerged more gradually over time, just because that's how I've been using my decks. Some of this has emerged as a result of purposeful purchase, what's the word I'm looking for? Like purchase on purpose. And some of this has emerged just more organically through diligent work on a specific deck, developing, you know, purposefully developing associations, but not necessarily realizing the way in which it would kind of really slot in quite well to a more sort of dedicated set of deck associations. Now, closing last remark is that again, I don't consider any deck exempt for use with deity work, because the way I personally function is that in every single moment I am existing within under the auspices of her wing, within the context of the goddess and so on. But there's definitely something to be said for certain decks that feel especially relevant or designated, or just really happy, special, good vibes, favorite topic-y kind of associations. So with that incredibly eloquent sentence left at the end there, I'm losing the light, which is, you know, timely. It's telling me to shut up. So I'm gonna go now, and I hope everyone is doing well to the best of their ability and taking care of themselves and being kind, and I will see you all next time. Bye!